said, show up. Show up to the fight of your life. Show up. We also said that showing up is half of the battle. And so today we want to talk about the other half of the battle. Show up. You can't just show up to the fight. You have to show up. You have to fight with faith. And that's the title of my talk this morning. Can you touch somebody, look at a neighbor and say, fight with faith? Yeah. Maybe that person understands. Find someone else and tell them, fight with faith. Yeah, tell them that. Tell them, fight with faith. Fight with faith. Now, this morning I'm talking about faith. In order for you to understand the magnitude of David's fight or the magnitude of his faith, we have to understand the difference between the armor of Goliath versus the armor of David. If you remember, David is fighting. He's in the middle of a crisis. He is fighting a giant. And so to understand the faith that it required, you have to understand the weaponry or the weapons or the armor that Goliath used, and you compare it with the armor that David used. All right? So in the verse, 1 Samuel chapter 17, I want you to look at the armor of Goliath, 1 Samuel 17, verse 5 and 7. And so here's the armor of Goliath. And he had a bronze helmet on his head. He wore scale armor which weighed 5,000 shekels of bronze. Okay, next. He also had bronze greaves on his legs and a bronze javelin slung between his shoulders. This is all talking about Goliath. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the head of his spear weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield carrier walked in front of him. This was the armor of Goliath. Now, I want to explain, so I looked online and I found a picture of what that really looks like. So we have this picture here, and so what's shown in this picture is the way that a Roman soldier would be dressed at the time. So this man had a helmet to protect his head. He had what they call a coat of mail. It's kind of like this metal sheet that covers the central part of his body. He had a sword. He had a spear. He also had greaves to cover parts of his ankles and his shin. And the only thing that is not pictured here is the person that was in front of him that had a shield. So he had a person walk in front of him in order to protect him, in order to keep him safe. So what they call this the six-fold armor of Goliath. So let's review the next slide. So he had a bronze helmet, a scale armor, bronze greaves, bronze javelin, a spear, and he had a shield carrier, a whole person walking in front of him to make sure that he is protected. That was the armor of Goliath. Does that make sense so far? Everybody understands how well protected this man was? Everybody understands how experienced he must have been? Everybody understands how they say that Goliath was about 9 feet tall. And so this was not just a regular man. This man was huge, very intimidating. And so here is David walking against the biggest person, the biggest crisis of his life. And so that was the armor of Goliath. And so let's compare that with the armor of David. And so the armor of David in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 40, here's the armor of David. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in the shepherd's bag, which he had, that is in his shepherd's pouch. And his sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. All right, so we looked at the armor of Goliath. We see how well equipped he was. We see how experienced he was. We see that Goliath, he was ready to fight. But now it's interesting that when we compare the armor of Goliath to the armor of David, we see that David had a few things. You know, he had some stuff. He had a staff. Go back to the verse. He had a staff. Go back to the verse, please. In 1 Samuel 17. So he had a staff. He had smooth stones. He had the shepherd's bag. He had a pouch. He had his sling. And then he approached the Philistine. So if we review David's armor, if you go to the next slide, you will see that David had a staff. David had 5 stones. David had a shepherd's bag. David had a sling. Now, a lot of times in the Bible, there's a lot of symbolism in the Bible. So the staff was used from the shepherd, and the staff was used for many reasons. The staff was used for the shepherd in case he tripped, and so he would he would depend on the staff as he is walking. And so the staff here, it represented dependence upon God. Like, God, I'm in the middle of this crisis. I don't know how it's going to end, but I'm depending on you. And so not only did he have the staff, but he had 5 stones. And I've always asked myself, why is it that he chose 5? Is it that David did not have strength or faith in God? David could have, if he had so much faith in God, he could have selected 1 stone. Why is it that he selected 5 stones? Well, I believe that David selected 5 stones because David wanted to be prepared. You see, sometimes you can go one time and nothing happened. And then so David is saying, I'm going to try the first time. If nothing happens, I'm going to take the second one. And I'm going to try a second time. If nothing happens, I'm going to take a third one. And I'm going to try a third time. If nothing happens, I'm going to take a fourth one. And I'm going to try it until I see victory. David was prepared. So he had a staff, he had 5 stones, he had a shepherd's bag. A shepherd's bag, what is that? It's a bag that the shepherd had in order to put whatever provision that the shepherd purchased for the sheep. And so the shepherd can find something on the street or could find some food. And so the shepherd, what was in the shepherd's bag was provision. And so the shepherd's bag represented provision. It was David's way of saying, symbolically, that God, in the middle of this crisis, I'm counting on you to provide for me. I'm counting on you to provide for my physical body. I'm counting on you to provide spiritually. And so he had a staff, which represented the dependence on God. He had 5 stones, which represented the preparation of David. He had the shepherd's bag, which represented the provision that God would give to him. He had a sling. The sling was basically used in order to protect. When a shepherd was trying to protect his sheep, he would use a sling in order to protect. And so symbolically, David is saying, I'm using this sling in order to protect the army of Israel from this giant. Does that make sense so far, church? Does that make sense, everyone? And so David had a staff, he had stones, he had a bag, he had a sling, but there was one last. Someone say one last. Someone say one last. Say one last. There was one last weapon that David had that, and I'm going to say this weapon was an invisible weapon. This weapon, Goliath did not see this weapon. This weapon was a weapon that people did not see. The army of Israel did not see it. Goliath did not see it. David had one last weapon, and this weapon was the X factor. This weapon was the weapon that allowed for him to win the victory, and this last weapon was called faith. Somebody say faith in God. Faith in God. Faith in God. You see, Goliath trusted in himself. David trusted in his God. We're living in a generation where they tell you to trust in yourself. They tell you to believe in yourself. They tell you that as long as you have trust in yourself, in your abilities, in your ways, then you will not go through crisis. The thing is, if you could do it yourself in the first place, you would never be in a crisis in the first place. If you could handle the problem, you would never be in a crisis. You would have resolved the problem a long time ago. The reason why you're in a crisis, it's because you tried your way. You tried your resources. And at the end of it, you realize that you can't do it. And so because of that, David is saying, I'm not trusting in myself. I'm trusting in God. And so in 1 Samuel 17, verse 45, David is saying, you come with me with a sword, a spear, a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. There's a difference between believing in yourself and believing in God. Culture tells you to believe in yourself. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm all for self-confidence. Have confidence in yourself. But there are certain situations, you know I can't do this by myself. David is against a giant, a champion, 9 feet tall, with a bronze helmet, with all types of equipment. And so David is in a situation where he can no longer trust in himself because he only has a sling, he has some stones, he has a bag, and he has a few things, but there's no way that David is able to overcome Goliath. And so he needed that 5th element. He needed that 5th armor. He needed that 5th weapon, which was his faith, not in himself, but it was his faith in the God that he serves. I'm here to encourage somebody. I know society is telling you to believe in yourself. By all means, have confidence in yourself. But let me encourage you to believe in God first. Believe in the God that you serve. Have faith in the God that you serve. And the God that you serve, He will use you. He will use your family. He will use your talent. He will use your skills. But have faith, not in yourself first, but have faith in the God that you serve. We need to have faith in God. Bring the faith back to God. Don't put it in anyone else. Don't put it in anything else. Don't even put it in yourself, because you have proved that you can't do it by yourself. And so what made David different, the difference maker in the life of David, was the faith that he had, not in himself, but the faith that he had in God. It is very similar in times of crisis. When you go through times of crisis, there's going to be the temptation to trust in yourself, to trust in your own skills, to trust in the things that you have to offer. Can I encourage you this morning not to put so much trust in yourself and to put that trust back in God? God will use you. Don't get me wrong. He will use you, but He will use you. You see the difference? He will use you. And so people in this society, they say, I'm going to use myself. I'm self-made. I'm the reason why I'm here. I'm the reason. And we focus on ourselves to the point where we worship ourselves. We worship our efforts. We worship the things that we've done. Meanwhile, God is saying, just put your faith in me, show up to the fight, and fight with faith. But let me say this, that David is not the only person who had faith in God. Let me tell you that everyone in the Bible, every major figure in the Bible went through some type of crisis. Every major figure in the Bible, from Abraham to Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Daniel, David, Solomon, Paul. They all went through a major life crisis. And what they all had in common was in the crisis, they had faith in God. They had faith in God. Let me show you this in Hebrews 11. In Hebrews chapter 11, it talks about people who had faith in God. We're talking about Abraham. We're talking about Moses. We're talking about Paul. We're talking about the people who had faith in God in the middle of their crisis. And so in Hebrews chapter 11, when you like verse 32 and 34, and after listing different people, before we look at this verse, let me just give you some context of this passage. It was listing different people who believed in God throughout history. So it was talking about Abraham. Abraham believed in God, even though he didn't see the promise, but he believed in the promise. It talked about Joseph. It talks about Isaac. It talks about Jacob. It talks about all of these great people. It even talked about a prostitute named Rahab. And because she had faith, her name showed up on this list because of her faith, not in herself, but her faith in God in the middle of the crisis. And so after talking about all these different people, and we pick up on Hebrews 11, verse 32 through 34, it says, "And what more shall I say, for time will fail me?" And it's basically saying, I don't have time to talk about the rest of these people, but it just mentions them. It says Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets, whom by what? Come on, church, be with me. Who by what? Who by faith conquered kingdoms, performed acts of righteousness, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions. They quenched the power of fire. They escaped the edge of the sword. From weakness, they were made strong, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. All of these men, all of these women, they're showing up, and we're reading about them today. What their faith was applied more than 3,000 years ago for some of them. We're reading about them today, not because they were perfect, but because in the middle of their crisis, they trusted God, and God came through. In the middle of the tough times, they trusted God, and God came through. In the middle of someone passing away, they trusted God, and God came through. David showed up to the fight, but he didn't show up empty-handed. David showed up to fight, and he showed up with faith. He fought the fight with faith. And that's my encouragement to you this morning, to fight your fight with faith. Fight it with the faith that God, the one who called, he is faithful enough to take you all the way to the end, because he is a faithful God. I work in a healthcare setting, and a lot of times people come and they're sick. They come and they're sick. And so what happens is that the doctor will give a prescription. What you're supposed to do with the prescription, you're supposed to take the prescription to a pharmacy. The pharmacy takes the prescription, they dispense the prescription, they give it to you, you go home, you take the pill, you take the capsule, and hopefully after that you feel better. Did you ever think of the amount of faith that you had to have in the doctor who wrote the prescription? Can you think about it a little bit? First of all, they write a prescription that sometimes you can't even read. You don't even know what they're giving you. You don't know if what they're giving you is really for what you're really going through or not. But nonetheless, the pain is so bad. The crisis is so bad. You go to the pharmacy and then you pick up the medication. You go back home and you don't know what they gave you at that pharmacy. You don't know. How would you know? You take their word for it. And you take the medication. And then eventually you get healed. But before you got healed, you had faith in the doctor who prescribed the medication. And so I'm here to tell you that the doctor is prescribing something this morning. And then this doctor is prescribing faith. He's prescribing faith in your situation. He is prescribing faith in your crisis. He is prescribing faith in your traumatic moment. He is prescribing faith in whatever it is that you're going through. If you can't have a child, he is prescribing faith. If you had a miscarriage, he is prescribing faith. If you took the exam and you did not pass, he is prescribing faith. If your marriage is upside down and you don't know if your family is going to stick, he is prescribing faith. The doctor is in this place and he is saying, have faith, my child. Have faith, son. Have faith, daughter. I know the crisis. It's going. I know the crisis. It's taking a lot of time, but have faith in me this morning. Have faith in the doctor, because the doctor is prescribing something and he is saying, if you would believe in me, the author and the finisher of our faith. Did you know that that's who they describe Jesus as? He is the author and the finisher of our faith. In other words, to even have faith, we need him. Isn't that funny? To have faith in him, we need him. And so this morning, I want to pray for some people. I want you to pray for yourself. We're going to have a prayer of faith. Would you stand to your feet? Hallelujah. Come on, everyone. Come on, church. Come on, start giving God a round of applause this morning. Let's set the atmosphere of prayer. Give God a round of applause. Yeah, he deserves it. We're setting the atmosphere of prayer in this place. In Jesus' name.